Ville, a community service of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University.
Much better.
All right, there's the knock. Welcome to the Wednesday, April 8, 2015 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. First order of business is approval of the minutes of March 25th.
I'll move to approve. I'll second.
Okay. Deb and Wendy have moved and seconded. Are there any observations, corrections?
My only question was about what Nell said, but he isn't here to defend himself, so yeah.
Okay. All right, hearing no corrections, all in favor of the minutes as written, say aye.
Aye.
And opposed? And abstentions.
Abstain.
We'll record Mr. Obermeyer and Mr. Dickinson as abstaining. All right. Next up, correspondence. Mike, do you have any news for us about the ADU revisions?
I do. They were recently passed as Planning and Zoning Commission had recommended to Council, and this happened this last Monday. Ended up being a 4-2 vote, but passed as presented. So that'll come into effect when they're published in the paper this Saturday.
Wow. What, 2.5 years?
It's longer than that, because I've been on, you were talking about it before I came on this commission.
4-2. All right. I went to an interesting meeting last night in Palouse, which seemed to be jointly organized by the mayor, Michael Echanova, I believe, and the SWEA, Southeast Washington Economic Development Association or whatever. Robin Olgren Evans is the party. And the subject was tiny houses. And they had somebody down from La Crosse who was setting up to start to build these tiny houses, which are, they build them on trailers predominantly, and they're smaller than our ADU. They're sort of run in the 200, 250 square foot range, measured outside, and maybe they squeeze a little loft in up above part of it. Interesting presentation, but the conversation that I got into with the mayor was around the sort of zoning issues. How do you think about these? Could you write a zone description that would allow you to have a tiny house but wouldn't have a standard sort of trailer house? And we had various interesting conversations, and the other being the tax implications of personal property rather than real property if the city started to develop a bunch of space that way. Anyway, it was an interesting conversation. And then the other thing to share is, came across my desk, a event being organized for April 24 and 25. That's probably Earth Day weekend. Building a Resilient Palouse in the Age of Climate Change. It's a series of discussions on Friday evening at 7 and Saturday all day long, it looks like. A series of topics related to climate change and planning. Anything else that people have seen? Okay. Joel, Transportation Commission meeting.
The next transportation meeting will be tomorrow at 4 o'clock. The agenda is focusing on bicycles, downtown bicycle parking and bicycle wayfinding signage. Also on the agenda is a discussion dealing with Prospect Place subdivision. I suspect that's probably an item which is going to come before this commission and sometime in the future, so I'm probably going to have to absent myself from the commission for that. But tomorrow, 4 to 6.
Okay. All right. We are up to the open microphone portion of the agenda. And right now, we have no people in the audience, so I will remind the viewers at home that this is a time when you can come down and share thoughts that you have on matters that are not on the agenda or currently pending before Planning and Zoning Commission. Did you come for public mic?
I did.
All right, we'll let you catch your breath. Catch your breath, and then go to the microphone and give us your name and address, please.
Hello, my name is Keegan Caldwell. I'm the AmeriCorps Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Moscow. I live at 536 Ridge Road. I'm here today actually on city business. The city is collecting demographic data on the members of our various commissions. We need to pull together some information for a report that we do annually. We just need to know what your name is, what commission you serve, your gender, and then the race or ethnicity you identify as. So you have a couple options. On this list, you have the option to select one, multiple, or choose not to identify, and then the date that you completed. So if I could, I'd like to pass these out and then collect them back. It's just a quick question, if that's all right with you all.
Are you going to every commission, or can we hit to it one shot?
I'm going to every commission, so yeah.
So I think the question was if you would, so in which case, let's not complicate it.
Right. Okay, gotcha.
We each serve on another commission as well.
When I get back to you again, if you've already filled it out, when I see you again, you can just tell me that and just not fill it out again.
Okay.
Or when I go to collect all the data, I'll pull out the duplicates. But
Okay. Keegan, would it work for you to distribute them, and then we'll start our public hearing? We'll just fill it out and give them all to Mike or to Ann?
Yeah, that works just
Then
fine.
you'd
for
have
me.
them in the morning.
Yeah, that works just fine for me.
Okay. That way you don't have to hang out and we don't have to delay.
Yeah, definitely. So I can just come over tomorrow, Mike, then. And,
Yeah, that works.
And pick them
Yeah,
up. Cool.
Definitely, thanks.
Definitely.
Great, thank you. So maybe you and I will note the commissions that we serve on, and then that will just, rather than duplicate everything.
Yeah,
Okay.
on the commission, if you want, you can just write both commissions.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'll make a note of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And then if you have any people that are missing, would you let Mike know and I can make a note of that?
We are missing 3 tonight.
Okay. So, because I'll have to give them an email copy then.
Okay.
So, yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Keegan.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Great. So, I think next on our agenda is the public hearing on Amendment Title 4, Chapter 3, Chapter 11, Chapter 12 of the Moscow City Code regarding temporary uses. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Before you tonight, we have a proposed legislative amendment to add temporary uses to the zoning code. And just wanted to start out with a little bit of background as to what temporary uses were. They're generally temporary sales display stands. Could be Christmas tree stands, fireworks stands, sunglass stands, produce stands, blanket stands, or any other stands that we generally have within the city of Moscow on a temporary basis. Currently, we don't have temporary uses defined within the zoning code. And generally, if the temporary use is allowed within the underlying zoning district, usually it's allowed as a retail use, then we generally just say that it's an allowed use and they don't need to do anything with our office and go through any requirements. We had 2 issues come up over the last year. We had one fireworks stand in a residential zone, and that happened to be on an undeveloped lot. The issue with that was that we didn't allow residential In the residential zoning district, we don't allow retail sales, so that was the issue with that one. I was also located at a busy intersection, and the parking and access was a problem as well. We also had an issue of a produce stand, which is located near the south couplet of Moscow. It was also on an undeveloped lot, and that was also in close proximity to a busy intersection, state highway. The access points were undefined in this location. People were entering at various locations and going across the whole property. And there was also a tendency for dust or mud to be generated on this site just because of its large nature and how far you had to go in order to access the stand. There was also poor circulation on that site. And so from here, staff had looked at multiple jurisdictions, which included Boise, Post Falls, Spokane Valley, Eugene, Oregon, and LeGrand, Oregon, as to how they currently regulate temporary uses. And most of them require temporary use permits submitted to the Community Development Office in order to review things like vision triangle. So this is at the street intersection. Typically, you're required to have objects or structures be placed at a certain height so they don't impede oncoming traffic within these areas. And so they wanted to look at structures within those site triangles. Also wanted to check setbacks to make sure the structures that were being placed met the current setbacks for the zoning district they were in. Wanted to make sure there was adequate circulation so there wasn't going to be any type of safety hazard on the property, and that the access points were clearly defined so it didn't present a safety hazard to the adjacent roadway. Also wanted to check the duration. Most of them regulated or limited the duration of temporary uses to 30 days. And they also wanted to make sure that the zoning district in which they were proposing to be located in was the appropriate zoning district for those uses. And so, based upon that research and direction from Planning and Zoning Commission, I drafted a proposed ordinance before you tonight. And within Chapter 3, which is our central business, general business, motor business, industrial, and urban mixed commercial zones, those are the zones that predominantly allow retail uses of this nature. We would be adding under permitted principal uses and structures, temporary uses, and they would be subject to the specific use standards of Chapter 12 of this zoning code. And so that's our, Chapter 12 is really the specific use standards section of our zoning code. So those standards would be inserted in that section. Within Chapter 3, there was a concern, mainly in the motor business zone, about landscape supply yards. Some of those associated with maybe Moscow Building Supply seasonally when they expand into their parking lot, or Walmart when they do the same thing, or Fiddler's Ridge that takes over a portion of the East Side Marketplace parking lot. There may have been some concern with the current language as we had discussed. And what staff had done was gone in and inserted or clarified under the permitted principal uses and structures under motor business zone. It lists all the retail enterprises within that zoning district, and at the end you see building and material stores and yards. It inserted landscape so as to not get caught up within the definition of a temporary use or be constrained as being a temporary use. Then within the limitations on use section, within that motor business zone, all uses shall be conducted wholly and entirely within enclosed buildings except, had to go in there, it lists a wide number of uses that are allowed to not be within enclosed buildings, and we'd just be adding landscape supply yards to give it a distinct definition under that section. We'd also add temporary uses as permitted by this code underneath that section as well. And then brings us to, also within Chapter 3, the industrial zoning district, under the permitted principal uses and structures portion of that section. We'd just be, this is strictly for consistency, and so right now it says building materials, stores, and yards. Actually, it says building materials yards, and so we'd be making that consistent with the term in the motor business zone to say building and landscape materials, stores, and yards. Then within Chapter 4, which includes our definition section, we would be inserting temporary use, and that would be a land use established for a limited duration which does not require permanent site improvements. Temporary uses include, but are not limited to, the erection of temporary structures for activities such as fruit and vegetable sales, Christmas tree sales, fireworks sales, art sales, and other retail sales permitted in the zoning district within which the proposed use is to be located. So that brings us to Section 12, specific use standards. As always, we go through under temporary uses an applicability and purpose portion, which is described as the intent of this section to allow temporary uses upon developed or undeveloped commercial property within the city and subject to the following standards. And these standards are intended to reduce the potential traffic, parking, safety, and nuisance issues associated with the short-term nature of these temporary uses. And that goes into specific standards portion where we address site access. And so we want to look at ingress, egress to the subject property and make sure there's an established vehicular approach. So this is usually on a developed site or a temporary approach as approved by the city engineer. And so we want the city engineer to say there's no curb on the property, it's undeveloped. We want to establish access points so that it doesn't present a safety hazard to whether it be pedestrian, bicyclists, or adjacent vehicles. And then it goes on to say approaches shall be clearly identified, and this is a last-minute addition for our city engineer. He would like to add and delineated, and shall not present a traffic hazard to the adjacent roadway as determined by the city engineer. And so this is an addition from what's in your packet before you tonight. And then we address site circulation. Vehicular circulation shall be delineated and maintained on the subject property in order to reduce the risk of vehicular conflicts and ensure orderly circulation, so it won't present a traffic hazard, circulation and parking on the site. Setback requirements, just want to make sure that all temporary structures meet the minimum setbacks of that zoning district in which they're located. Talk about the vision triangle as well. Want to make sure that all temporary structures are located outside of the street intersection site triangle, and that includes all displays, goods, objects placed within the street intersection site triangle shall be in accordance. And these are adopted from council from time to time, and recently adopted last year our city standard construction specification and drawings. And so these have a standard drawing within them that shows what's allowed, usually shrubs and other objects that are 3 feet or less in height are allowed within the intersection site triangle, but anything over in that height is not allowed. We want to regulate duration and to say that each temporary use may not exceed 30 days per calendar year. This doesn't have to be consecutive. They could break this up. So in the case of the produce stand that was showing up every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they would just add up over the course of the year. Nuisances, just wanted to make sure there's not going to be any nuisances generated such as dust, noise, tracking of dirt in the public right-of-way, or other nuisances in general on the subject property. And then the last section is just the permits required for any temporary use conducted on an undeveloped property or property which does not have an existing developed parking area. So all these regulations will apply to all temporary uses, but they won't have to come in and get a permit, say, Howard Hughes parking lot for the Christmas tree sales. None of those folks will just proceed as they usually do because they already have all the access points defined. They're generally outside of the setbacks. And they won't even have to come in and talk to us. They'll just be the ones that are on these undeveloped properties that may have, potential for more of an issue with the regulations than ones that are on developed property. So with that, the commission action tonight is to conduct a public hearing and upon consideration of testimony presented, either recommend approval of the proposed ordinance as presented, recommend approval with modifications, or do not recommend approval and take other action as deemed appropriate. And certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Questions for Mike? Mike, I have one regarding our efforts at the urban ag ordinance. I'm not remembering what we said in there about on-site sales of produce. Is that going to run into a conflict with this?
We had checked that previously, and there is no conflict.
Okay.
Usually, in most of the residential zones, you're required to go through the conditional use permit process, and we made sure the definition was not consistent with our definition of retail sales for urban ag. So we had checked that.
Okay, great.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Mike, can you go back to the slide with the access? I had a question about the access. Yeah. So in the site access, if there is already an established approach, that's a use. For example, if it's from, I guess, Jackson Street heading south, and is that the Christ property there? There's a curb cut from that street. And I believe that's been authorized by the highway department, the state highway department?
Correct.
So there's nothing the city can do about that?
Yeah, any property adjacent to the state highway system, it'll be Idaho Transportation Department's jurisdiction, and so city engineer wouldn't have any jurisdiction. It's only in the case where there's no vehicular approach to the property, say there's no curbing outside. So the way it currently reads, vehicular ingress, egress from the subject property shall be from an established vehicular approach or a temporary approach as approved by the city engineer. So as long as there's a current approach on the property, they're more than welcome to use that approach. It's already established. It's already there. We can't tell anybody that they can't. They wouldn't be able to use an approach that's already there.
Okay, thanks.
Two other activities popped into my head that I hadn't thought of as temporary uses, so I want to see what your reaction is. At the food co-op, the fish people show up on Fridays and roll in a trailer and sell there in the co-op parking lot.
Excuse me, Nels. There's nobody here, but you did not open the public hearing and close it. And now you're taking testimony from members, and I don't think you're supposed to do it that way.
Okay. So the simplest thing to do would be to open the public hearing
And close it. And then,
and invite testimony from the public, none of whom are present.
yeah,
And I will now close the public hearing
there you go.
and return to the question to Mike. Thank you, John.
Well,
Well, otherwise, we would have
It doesn't
wandered
show
off.
up in the minutes,
We
so
would
we
have
have-
wandered off the whole evening and never have done that little theater. Fish people, and then the other is the Tuesday Growers Market. Various vendors come in, set up on the co-op parking lot for half the afternoon on Tuesdays.
They won't be there anymore. It's moving.
The Tuesday Growers Market is moving off the parking lot.
That's the plan, yes.
So it will be somewhere else and won't act that way. So my only question is now regarding the fish people.
Well, I would say that they'd probably be a temporary use, but just knowing they're only there on Fridays, so even if, and they're not there from January, February, March, they come back, I think last weekend was the first day they were back, so they're gone 4 months out of the year, as well as right before Christmas, and so, they still wouldn't exceed the 30-day limit.
Okay, so it's the 30-day clock, and that's...
Yeah, and they just
Okay.
it wouldn't be consecutive, it would just be, they got a day here, day there.
Great. I just didn't want us to inadvertently catch something that we didn't mean to.
Yeah, that would be pretty close, though. It'd be 8 months, 4 days a month. I come up with 32. I mean, I doubt seriously if it would ever, I don't know how it would become an issue if they were there for 31 days rather than 30 in a calendar year.
What's the enforcement mechanism? Complaint?
It's usually complaint basis, correct.
Trust the co-op not to complain too much.
Yeah.
Okay, other questions for Mike? All right. So we have heard staff's presentation. We have opened and closed the public hearing. We have question staff, discussion, and then we'll vote.
Yeah, just kind of, I'll blame you for bringing it up. I was wondering if we might want to consider changing that 30 days to 52 days, because then if somebody's doing something 1 day a week, which is probably most likely, they would be covered.
Certainly welcome to do that, yeah.
I mean, I'll just throw that out as a proposal, I don't know. It's, like I say, it's probably never going to be an issue if somebody is there 31 days, but it might be nice to have the
Well, even
T's crossed.
even Christmas tree lots sometimes start before Thanksgiving, and if they go all the way up to Christmas Eve, you're getting tight on the 30 days as well. And I was thinking of the same thing. That would be my only, question as well.
I still think this is a solution looking for a problem. I remember when this first came up, there were the two instances that Mike pointed out at the beginning of the presentation. One of them could have been solved by simply enforcing the code as written, that you can't have a retail use in that particular space, and the city decided to let that go, which is fine. I think that's great. So we're dealing with one instance which may or may not come up again, and I think the danger is that when you try to regulate for one instance that may come up again, may not, and given all the discussion we had to have to make sure we weren't including too many fish in the net, the law of unintended consequences tends to set in really quickly. And we've already had, the issue of, well, is the fish guy there more than 30 days, or is a Christmas tree stand there more than 30 days? And I think it's premature for a regulation like this.
I would kind of say the major point of this regulation is so that you can say yes to people, rather than the instance of where somebody was doing something in an area that was not allowed. Your only choices then are to boot them out right now, or you have some process where you can say, yeah, you can go ahead and do this. And I don't really see this as being particularly limiting. I see it as being more of a allowing the city to say yes to things rather than limiting what people can or cannot do. They're pretty wide open in terms of what particular hoops you have to jump through.
Would one or the other of you like to make a motion?
I would move that we take no action on this and, table it or simply take no action on it.
Okay.
I would move we take no action on it and not forward it to City Council.
And not forward it to City Council. Okay, that's the motion. Is there a second? I think your motion died for lack of a second.
Sounds like it.
Kurt, do you want to take a shot?
I would make a motion that we replace the 30 days with 45 days.
With 45 days.
Or, yeah.
Do you want to go
30
on?
days in a calendar year to 45 days in a calendar year. I think that should be enough to cover virtually all instances.
Do you want to go on and recommend that we move that we recommend this to council?
Or if it were an amendment within
You
the motion.
want to amend it first?
Yeah, amend it first, and then I would think.
So we have a motion to amend the 30-day time to 45 days. Is there a second
I will
to that?
second that.
Mr.
Joel?
Chair?
Yes.
And also the city engineer's request there, and
Oh.
if the commission feels comfortable with that addition,
Okay.
that'd have to
Oh,
be added
because
as
that was
well.
not in the noticed public hearing, so we have to amend that in.
That was not in the ordinance that I'd put in your packets.
Yes,
So,
okay.
yeah.
So that's a request to amend that in.
Are you gonna, you can move it to do that.
Yeah,
I guess it's part
Let's
of the
make it
motion.
clean and just do it in two pieces. I've got the motion for 45 days with the second from Joel. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And Gregory? I'm not sure. You're going to go, okay. Now, yes. Joel. Oh, sorry. And now, is anyone interested in making a
I
motion?
move that we add the language suggested by the city engineer.
I'll
Okay.
second that.
And Wendy is a second for that. All in favor of adding the language "and delineated under the specific standards" section? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions. Okay, so I think each of those is passed. Now, we have an amended ordinance to recommend to council, if anyone would care to make such a motion.
I move that the ordinance be recommended to council
With the amendments.
with the amendments.
Okay, and a second?
Second.
Deb, thank you. Any further discussion? I will say that I also sit, at least on the fence with you, Gregory, on the question of, is this really needed? And I guess I haven't thought about it long enough to think about simply saying no. So, but I guess I wonder at what point do we regulate and over-regulate and overcomplicate everything? And
I see it more from the point of view of somebody wanting to do this and sort of having a clear path to be able to do it. And so I see it more in a positive light than a preventative. That's,
okay.
you know.
And certainty is a nice thing, as opposed to, I mean, we talk about this in other ways in the zoning code, flexibility versus certainty. All right, any other discussion? Mike?
And just an addition that temporary uses are currently not defined within our zoning code, so they're not listed underneath any of the zoning districts, which with the exclusionary nature of our zoning code, if something's not included or specifically listed in there, it's just assumed that it's not allowed. And so, you know, that was the main purpose of at least getting to temporary uses. And it just so happened that we had those two instances this last year, and that's really why we had moved forward with it. But it's always kind of been on the back burner to at least put some recognition of temporary uses within the zoning code. And so these types of uses could continue, and somebody didn't challenge that they weren't allowed, or we had some other issue. So,
Okay.
Does this also cover things like the blood, the bus that comes to do the blood donations?
No.
Oh, how does it not? That's curious. Is
They're
that
not selling anything. It's retail sales.
It's
You're
not
giving.
retail. It's a donation bus. Okay. All right. Thank you for the clarification on the on extending the so that it is actually covered in our zoning code. So with that, unless there's other discussion, all in favor of recommending the ordinance as amended to council, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Gregory is nay, and abstentions. You clear, Ann? All but one. Okay. Thank you, Mike. I guess you can stay up there. You're at bat again for the Legacy Crossing Design Guidelines Window Opening Requirement Review.
Okay. Well, this is just picking up our discussion. If you recall last time where we left off, we had gone through off-street parking requirements within Legacy Crossing and urban mixed commercial zones, and now we were discussing window coverage requirements within the Legacy Crossing Overlay District. And looking at the design guidelines, we'd gone through the general building facade design requirements of buildings within Legacy Crossing, and gotten to the window opening requirements and started discussing that, and mainly the point that states that 50 to 85% of ground floor facades that front public streets and pedestrian ways should be occupied by windows and or entry doors. And after discussing the recent market analysis that was completed and just the ability of through a conditional use permit within Legacy Crossing overlay district in order to achieve residential on the ground floor. But also the market analysis indicated that residential was fairly strong in the market as well as medical office. So with those two additions, we may see something other than we had originally envisioned with just strictly retail on the ground floor. And so we started looking at an example of the Sangria development that was submitted and looking at kind of the percentage. And when staff was reviewing these, it just struck us as once we were calculating the percentages, they were all coming in fairly low, close to that 50% threshold. So originally we had thought that maybe we should ratchet that down a little bit and allow actually a little bit more leeway there with window openings and door openings on the ground floor. So we had looked at Sangria example with this blank wall. You're obviously at 50% here. Looked at just excluding the blank wall, coming in somewhere around 60%. We had reviewed that. And then what it would mean if we were to go maybe a little bit less than 50%, or achieve 50%, and what that would mean for the window openings. And this would be representative of 50% of the window area, and it equate to probably 6 inches to a foot reduction in the width of the window openings. But you go down to 40% and you have these taller windows like this, and you end up going in quite a bit. And so the massing starts to change substantially. You get the feel walking adjacent to the building starts to change quite a bit as well. You wanted me to provide some examples of some other buildings, and I did that. This is the 1912 Center, which came in to be about 50% with the courtyard area. About 52% if you don't include those windows on either side. And we also pulled up previous plans from University Point development and measured or calculated the ground floor retail spaces here, which came in at about 52%. So right around that 50% threshold. So at that point, staff had proposed that we leave 50 to 85% of the ground floor facades, but specify retail uses that front public streets and pedestrian ways should be occupied by windows and or entry doors. And then potentially also add another section which states that the ground floor facades of all other uses that front public streets and pedestrian ways may have less than 50% window and or entry door area when not located along primary activity centers in the Legacy Crossing overlay area. And I think the Commission was a little uncomfortable not setting a floor limitation there. So, not maybe it's 20%, 30%, and wanted staff to come back with some examples of ground floor residential development that you typically see within an urban area. And so what I had done, you may recall, if you had read the readings, shared readings, one of them was from Garland, Texas, I believe, the one that Nils shared. And I had just gone to that site, and this was part of that development. And so that had talked about possibly starting up retail now, or residential, and then being able to convert them into retail at some point in time. I think this is residential right now is what it appears to be, and other aspects of this project are retail. So the majority of the corners within this block are all retail, and they have larger window openings, but these are some examples of an urban environment. I think these are 3 stories in height, which may be similar to what we would see in Legacy Crossing. And these happen to be residential on the ground floor. And so when I calculated, and this is probably a plus 2-3% error rate because I'm going off of Google Earth on these, and so, but they're fairly accurate. And so this came out to be about 44% with the doors and the window openings in this example. Also went to some typical townhouses. I think I went to a neighborhood in Boston, Beacon Hill Heights, and looked at some of these models. So if we're going to maybe get townhouses within Legacy Crossing and what that would mean, ended up coming in. I included the the basement entry there for the door as well as the window well. And it came out to be about 40% of the wall area. Another one in Boston. This one ended up coming to be quite a bit less, about 33%. And I also included the door at the bottom there as well as the window wells towards the sidewalk also.
Looks like, go back a second, it looks like is that staining, or do you think they filled in some other windows along the base? You know, like there might have been two other ones, another one in between. I can't tell from them.
Yeah, I think those are window.
Yeah, but I mean, it almost looks like there might have been one, maybe not, underneath the space between them that was filled in. The brick looks different. Like not that way, the other way. To the right, yeah. I can't tell. I mean, it may just be staining.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, but it looks funny for an historic building, like something's been altered. That's why I would say maybe that's a sketchy case to use.
Sure. And this is an example. These are actually in Seattle. This is Brian Runberg Architecture Group's Stackhouse apartments, where they'd taken a whole city block, I think actually two of them, and created a large mixed-use development. And these were some examples of, actually, they were pretty consistent with all the residential apartments on the ground floor within that development. And so, as you can see, these are set back probably 5 feet from the edge of the sidewalk, and they have that buffering where there's some grass, a tree planted there. And so you have this little bit of private-public separation that he achieves with this. But looking at the window area, these came out to be about 40%. If you're wondering, that's a bioswale in the front there. They had captured all the, it actually goes the entire length of the block. It captures all the rainwater.
100%.
Yeah, 100% of that, and then conveys it. So those ended up being about 40% there. This was another example of the same development, just done a little bit differently. You can see the facade projections here, the articulations that divided up a little bit, but these are some examples. Looks like there's 3 residential units there, and I would venture to say that this is probably a retail space here on the end. You can tell by the arm bar there on the door, a little bit different, a lot more window area for those retail spaces. So that came out to be about the same. That was about 40%. You can tell they're mostly the same design. Yeah, he's just changed the facade a little bit to switch it up, but they're really probably the same floor plan and units there. And then this was, I just thought, would be maybe a good example of maybe what we might see in Legacy Crossing, where you have the major intersections when we talk in the proposed language about these major or these primary focus areas, and I think that those would most likely line up with the street intersections, and you can see this large retail space here on the corner of the intersection, and then it transitions into residential on the ground floor, and I think that that achieves that fairly nicely with a setback, and it doesn't seem out of place. It's still inviting to walk up against, and so I don't think you lose anything, even with the reduction of window area going down to about 40%. So after we reviewed those, I had gone in and just inserted at the end a statement saying that maybe they're allowed ground floor facades of other uses that front public streets and pedestrian ways may have less than 50% window in or entry door area when not located along primary activity centers in the LCO area. However, such ground floor facades should not have less than 35% occupied, should not be more than 35% occupied by windows in or entry doors. So just wanted to get the Commission's direction, if that's where we wanted to head from here, or if we wanted to go a different direction.
So I have 2 questions for you. On the first one, if we say that we work with 50%, do we really need to have the upper limit, or do we need the 85%? Can it be 50%, like more as a minimum?
Well, the guidelines talk about they don't want walls that are solid, but they
Glass.
don't want walls that are completely glass as well. And whether or not that comes through in the rest of the requirements, I mean, when you look through the rest of the building design requirements, you're not allowed to go completely glass anyway.
Right.
And so it's more...
Because it might be places, like in a stair tower, you might want all glass in that stair tower. And I guess I wonder, how that would be permissible then. Because, it's a safety thing, and it might be a sort of departure from the rhythm of everything else that's going on. And so how would you, I guess I'm a little concerned about, I think we need to articulate that, what you really mean by that upper limit a little better. Even in the sentence, just saying a minimum of and not to exceed 85% to just the way it reads right now, I don't know quite what it means when I look at it the first time. So a minimum of 50% and not to exceed 85% of ground floor of total length of the ground floor facades. I'm just trying to figure out a way that how could you work in stair towers that might be more transparent and other parts that might be more articulated with separations of solids.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's going to be the total length. So
Yeah.
maybe it's that's not clear. I mean, we're not going to just measure
Maybe you
one
need
portion
some
of it.
other little phrase in there to kind of clarify what you mean. And I haven't quite figured out what it is, but I didn't completely know what you meant when I first read it. So.
Well, that's the way it is right now in the regulations. The 50 to 85% of ground floor facades that front public streets or pedestrian ways should be occupied by windows or entry doors. So
Mike,
but we could certainly
No,
look at it.
it's okay.
And I think what I think Mike has done for illustrative purposes is you have cropped and only looked at portions
Correct.
for our thinking.
Yeah.
But in reality, you would go from sight line to sight line
Correct.
and do the whole thing. So
Yeah,
Wendy's big glaze section would just add a bit to the overall.
It would. It was like the example of Sangria in the beginning when you had, when we were looking at this area and included the wall. I think this is to the very end. Yeah, I mean, this is that whole frontage, and then it gets, over here is the intersection of, so this is 3rd or 6th, and then you have Jackson here. So this would be the intersection. That would be a completely other wall right there. But the wall extends here to there, but if you look at that, it's 54%. I was just providing examples that, well, if they have an issue with a percentage, they could add a window here, which they don't. They don't have an issue, but I was just giving illustrative examples of, what these percentages actually look like. But we would measure the whole wall.
Gregory.
Are there percentages for the upper floors?
There are, yeah. I believe it's 20%. Let me find it. Yeah, for all floors above the ground floor, windows should occupy at least 20%. And usually, light requirements are you're going to hit that anyway. So that when I was doing the review, all the proposals that that I looked at, they all met that and pretty easily met that.
It's striking how, when you look at it in terms of the percentage, how small a percentage you can have and still have a front look like it's got a lot of windows in it. Like that 33% one, that looked like lots of windows.
Yeah. And that's really what, when we were doing the review, that when these percentages were coming out, I was expecting, maybe Sangria's to come out somewhere around 65, 70%, and then we were coming out so low, then we just thought we'd take a look at it.
So then is 50% a tight floor that might be overly constraining? I mean, you're steering our thinking to say, relative to non-retail uses, but the Sangria's example or the University Point example, they're fairly close to 50%.
Yeah, originally we thought maybe we'd reduce that to 40%. So somewhere there was a little more liberal. Looking at these examples, that would be 40%. And then we got into the discussion of, well, You could achieve 40% if you were more of a square window there, and I mean, that's something you would probably like if you cut the window area off above. This is an awning here. So if you're at street level, you cut the window off here to get your 40%, and so you just had the whole large window opening. Well, that would still be the intent of the design guidelines, to cut it off there, but it would be pretty much vastly different if you did this, real vertical configuration of the window, and then you had this large wall area there, and it was just a little bit striking when you went down to 40%. But this is always something that the Commission's able to review as, going through the process. Any of these proposals within Legacy Crossing, it'll have to come before the Commission, and Commission will ultimately make the decision about whether or not it meets the guidelines or recommend changes to the guidelines. So.
Yeah, I'd think just in terms of retail space, the 50% is a lot more inviting than the 40%.
Sure.
So I think it's, to a large extent, it's going to be a problem that fixes itself, and if somebody's doing decent design work.
Well, you want to have people on the street be able to look in and see the products and the shoppers. This is just kind of simple planning methods.
I suppose it's possible, though, that you had some reason that you needed a blank wall because what was on the other side was a loading dock or some other.
Yeah, exactly.
Which could
and those
push
are
down
all,
your numbers.
and that's why we had left some flexibility within the guidelines. Instead of using shall for all these sentences, we had used should. And so there is already some built-in flexibility for the Commission to maybe there's some some circumstances like that maybe there's a stairwell that or an elevator shaft that you can't have windows on. And obviously you need to provide a little bit of flexibility in those circumstances. So.
So, thoughts from commissioners about what we would like to direct staff to do? We're kind of looking at that as an idea, I guess.
So you, in your examples, I think everyone was 40%, wasn't it? So why did you go down to 35, out of curiosity?
Well, some of the townhouse, so this is 33% here.
Okay. Yeah.
That one's around 40%. But I was thinking about 40%, but then I just went down to 35%. I'm not really married to that. It was just a number that I'd come up with.
Yeah, and in general, I kind of like having a little bit of leeway in there so that somebody has room to come up with some brilliant design that we haven't thought about that still looks okay.
I guess I would be happy with the one that's on the screen there.
With the languages shown.
Yeah.
Same here.
Okay. Mike, could you back up one or two to the, well, there, that either that'll do. So initially as built, retail ended up on the bigger corner unit on the left. But then over time, a lawyer decided to open up shop next door, or a bakery decided they could fit themselves into what's currently residential. And what I'm testing is, could it work? And the lawyer, I think, could work quite easily. I mean, they'd hang a shingle out somewhere, and it would look like a reasonable thing for being a business space.
Do you mean in the residential area?
In the resident,
Yeah.
as the mixed use
Yeah.
becomes,
Yeah.
shifts towards more commercial uses.
Yeah, I wouldn't see any issue with that. You could always make the window opening a little bit larger if you needed to, but I don't think you would need to in this circumstance. I think the larger issue would be ADA accessibility. You can't go upstairs. You have to have it, you'd have to have some type of ramp, and I don't know if you'd have room to fit that in there. And so that would be the biggest issue I see with this one is when they've tried to separate the public and private space by the stoop there, the 3-4 stair stoop, as well as the green strip in the front there, that kind of precludes your future commercial just because of ADA accessibility requirements. Once you go into commercial, you have to provide access to everybody.
Right.
Well, and depending on the type of commercial, there's a huge scale difference between those two spaces. One is a very tall ceiling, which most commercial space, when you design it, you want a 16, 20-foot ceiling. And then all of a sudden you have 8, 9-foot ceilings right next to it that might accommodate an attorney's office, but it's not going to accommodate a retail display. Very
Yeah,
well.
I can see maybe a professional office, live work type situation that would fit there.
But
Okay, I was just testing that it could evolve.
Yeah.
And that we might say, oh, yeah, that 35, 40% would be okay if it evolved to that.
Sure.
So I guess I'm hearing commissioners feeling like the language that Mike has up on the screen there, the tweak on the first paragraph, and then the second paragraph with the new underlined piece that we hadn't seen, that you're ready to think about moving this to public hearing. And that's where we would go next, right?
Well, we'd probably bring it back, I'd put it in ordinance form,
Put it in
and then
ordinance
bring it
form.
back one more time. I'd also put the off-street parking in ordinance form, so we can look at them both at the same time.
Oh,
and
we
then-
have that piece
and then-
also.
Yep, so we'll have those two pieces, but I'll go ahead and queue this up in ordinance or resolution form, and then I'll bring it back next time, one more look, and then we can proceed from there.
Okay.
I think that sounds like a great idea. Yep, good.
Everyone's agreeable with that. Thank you. And next up, outdoor seating in commercial zones.
Well, some of you may recall, this is, we had a discussion, it was late October of last year, about some nuisance issues with outdoor concert venues, and you wanted me to take a look at maybe some outdoor residential or outdoor restaurant seating. And so just wanted to go back through where we had come from up to this point for everyone. So summer of 2014, we had some complaints being submitted to the police department about outdoor concert music venue, and that was a property at the edge of central business, and then there was a residential neighborhood directly adjacent to that. So you had a transition of central business and then a residential zone. So you're probably going to encounter those types of nuisances when you have those abrupt changes between commercial and residential zones. So the way the police department handles these things are public nuisance noise prohibitions, and they have this within the police regulations, and so they talk about loudspeakers, radios, phonographs, amplifiers, stating the use or operation, permitting playing, use, or operation of any radio, receiving set, musical instrument, phonograph, loudspeaker, sound amplifier, other machine, a device for the production or reproduction of sound in which a manner as to disturb the peace, quiet, or comfort of another person. They have this actually within their regulations to enforce, and they have source requirements, and for business institutional zones, which is 65 decibels, measured from the property line, so complaints received. And this is only during the normal hours, and so I think the cutoff is 10 p.m. For any type of outdoor music anyway. And so they go out there and measure the 65 decibels at the property line and shut down the outdoor music, and so that's typically what happens in this type of circumstance. They also had issued maybe 1 or 2 amplified sound permits, and so you can get an exemption maybe a couple times a year if you're holding a charity concert or some special event in order to have an amplified sound permit. And so they'd issued a couple of those, but the complaints kept coming, and so they ended up not issuing any, and just the winter months ended up just ceasing the operation anyway. And so it pretty much resolved itself in the wintertime. And so I had brought this, I think it was October 22nd, Planning and Zoning Commission discussed this, about the possibility of maybe regulating more outdoor uses in commercial zones. We had gone through a lot of the allowed outdoor uses within those zoning districts, and the Commission felt that the existing noise and nuisance ordinance that were put in place already were intended to address this type of activity, and that no change to the zoning code was warranted. But you did want me to look at expanding allowance of outdoor seating areas associated with restaurants, and that was mainly in the neighborhood business zone. I think when we were looking at outdoor uses there, it specifically restricted those to wholly and enclosed buildings, which would not allow outdoor seating of a restaurant. And usually within a neighborhood business, if you have a restaurant, that's the nice thing, is to be able to sit outside. It's more residential in character, and so the Commission at that point indicated they'd like me to take a look at that. And so what I've done is look at the current restrictions that we have right now within across the board on the commercial zoning districts. And usually all the uses have to be conducted wholly in enclosed buildings. That usually shows up in the limitations on uses portion, and that's under each zoning district. And so when you go through the permitted uses, accessory uses, setback requirements, there'll be another section that talks about limitations on uses. And it varies from zoning district to zoning district. But within central business, general business, and urban mixed commercial, we don't have any prohibition on uses operating within enclosed buildings. So we don't have any issue with outside seating areas for cafes, restaurants, in those zones. RTO, we already say that all uses related to commercial activities shall be conducted wholly and entirely within an enclosed building, but we exempt out parking and loading areas and outdoor dining areas for eating or drinking establishments. So oddly enough, RTO is Alturas Technology Park, and you're only allowed one eating and drinking establishment, which hasn't been built to this point. And so, but they are exempt from the requirement that it be wholly within enclosed buildings. Motor business it also has that requirement to be conducted wholly and entirely within enclosed buildings, but they accept out a lot more uses than any other zone. And so there's a long list here. Temporary uses will end up, with that proposed amendment, if that's passed by council, we'll end up adding a couple there, temporary uses, but also landscape supply yards. And so those will be added. Just a little cleanup here. When we did the urban ag amendment, I think that's one use that's most likely going to occur outside. And so wanted to make sure that that is a permitted use within motor business. Just wanted to make sure that those weren't going to be excluded from being allowed to be conducted outside. And so just clean up, adding market garden, community garden, accessory gardening, including retail sales. So, but I'd like to note that they do have outdoor dining areas for restaurants. So letter K there above the market garden, that's excluded. So you're all right with motor business as well. That brings us to neighborhood business, which is really the only zoning district. It seems like we have an issue with that. And right now, as it currently exists under permitted principal uses, number 2 says retail sales and personal services conducted wholly within an enclosed building, including restaurants. And so what we propose would be to strike the wholly within an enclosed building portion. And then add, right now we have that reserved, so it's limitations on uses, but we have none specified right now. And so what we'd be proposing to do is go in and insert some subsections there that say that all uses shall be conducted wholly and entirely within enclosed buildings, except, once again, add the market garden, community garden, and the urban ag language, but also add outdoor dining areas for restaurants, and then outdoor play areas necessary for schools or daycares. Daycares are allowed use, and schools are a special use permit within that zone. So just wanted to make sure that those weren't going to be excluded, and also add, just to be consistent, the parking and loading areas within that. So that, covering the crux of what we would change if the commission wanted to proceed with amending neighborhood business to include those outdoor uses for seating for restaurants.
Sounds like a good idea.
Mike, where are neighborhood business zones? The only one I think of is at, it's the eye care place at 6th and Blaine.
Yeah, that's the majority of our neighborhood business. We have Picard Orthodontics, a portion of the Nazarene Church. There's what used to be Paris Vision, but I think that has switched owners since Dr. Paris retired. That's still a neighborhood business. And then there's another medical-type clinic next door that's neighborhood business. And actually, Short's Funeral Chapel is neighborhood business as well. And then the only other neighborhood business I believe I'm aware of, Perch on campus is neighborhood business.
Okay.
I think there's a great lesson in what happens when you start pulling on one end of a string, that it leads you to all of this that needs to be cleaned up, and it all started with noise complaints.
Sure. Yeah.
How about residential office?
Well, they don't.
It's quasi-commercial.
Yeah, it's mainly an R4 zone. So the only difference between residential office and multifamily residential is there's no limitation on professional office. So within R4, we allow up to 2,000 square feet of professional office. Within RO, there's no cap on that. So you're allowed however much professional office you can fit on a site. So, but there's no retail uses allowed or restaurant uses allowed within residential office.
What if you wanted to have an outdoor meeting area with your with your office in a...
It'd probably just be incidental to it's like a single-family house and sitting in your backyard type of thing.
Okay, so it wouldn't basically... Yeah.
All right. So I guess the question is direction for staff. Do we want to proceed to have this put into ordinance form and start the process towards a public hearing?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, bring that back next time.
All right. Okay. Then we're up to number 9, 2014 Citizens Survey Review.
We have to table this till next meeting. Administration's been pretty swamped, and they've been trying to get this done, but I think it's going to be presented to council on the next meeting of the City Council, which is going to be the 20th of April, I believe. And so should be able to get this on the 22nd at our next P&Z meeting. So I should have a citizen survey report at that point.
Do we need to do anything to formally table it, or just say, we'll see you again?
Say we can probably just table it till next meeting.
Okay. Shared readings discussion. Anyone have any thoughts about the two readings? One was kind of a graphical essay almost of different forms of mixed use, and then the other one was a example of attempting to build a area sort of like Legacy Crossing, it seemed, but realizing that it needed to start out for economic reasons, mostly residential, but how to build it such that it could ultimately transition towards more commercial.
Yeah, my thoughts on that one were that's a tough one to pull off, because first of all, it's you're asking the developer to spend extra money for something that may happen someday, because like one of the things they mentioned in there was putting in headers so you can pull out all the partition walls. Well, you're adding thousands of dollars for something that may or may not be important in the future, and that's kind of a hard sell when somebody's building something. Mm-hmm. It's difficult, I think, to effectively plan for multiple potential uses. We kind of saw that there with the building facades too. About sure, it looked great for a residence in terms of the window area and stuff, but but it would be pretty squishy if you were trying to put in a real retail area. Even though it's a concrete wall and it is set in stone, that doesn't mean you can't put in another window. But I think it gets almost unrealistically hard to try to plan those out for multiple uses. And especially when like I say, you're asking the developer to spend thousands of extra dollars for something that may or may not be important.
And meeting commercial code, building codes, as opposed to residential codes, too.
Yeah, I thought the Garland article was particularly eye-opening to me, because I labored under some of those assumptions that it's a matter of zoning, when a lot of it is a matter of building design and architecture and building codes. And we can't do anything about those things directly, other than lobby for others who have the power to change those things, to modify that, so that you do have the opportunity for more flexibility in use, or more flexibility in design to accommodate multiple uses over time.
Well, if you go back to the oldest building type out there, it would be the Roman insulae, and what that is pretty much what we think of as a mixed-use building when everything is in the same building, and it's retail, and then people used to live above their stores and apartments above that. But culture has departed from, it was a consistent building type through up until 1950, and then it's become more difficult. And so I guess I like to think more in terms of mixed-use neighborhoods than mixed-use buildings. Because it's really hard economically in a town this small, where you're not doing multiple layers of residential, to have retail, then office space, and all of a sudden you have the plumbing demands of one floor of apartments. It gets to be extreme. For what you can get back in rent, it becomes really expensive. And so thinking about how you have more minimum thresholds of uses within a neighborhood and try to target some of those, and think about downtown as part of that mixed-use neighborhood, that it might be more some of the commercial core. I know from talking to developers for Simplot a few years ago with my students, they talked about, and they were dealing with the condition of Boise and its sort of lack of retail downtown. At that point, it's getting better, but needing at least 2 contiguous blocks of retail for it to be viable. So enticing somebody to come and be the first tenant, is hard. So there's all these issues, and I think the more flexibility we can think about in terms of what mixed use really could mean. There were sort of 3 scenarios in that one that was more the mixed use neighborhood that on this block. That's more like what, if you looked at Manhattan, there's a corner store and then there's apartments, and something that's not a building that's trying to do everything. And I think it's ideal, but it's hard to do with contemporary development economics.
Wendy, you said that the living above and working below changed in about the 50s. Was that just because of cultural things?
Urbanization. And zoning. Quite frankly, zoning became planning. And so all of a sudden we segregated uses, and so that type of building struggled in that segregated environment. And it's nice to get back to more of an integrated view of what things should be, but it was really zoning more than anything.
Is there any research about the desirability of having that if the zoning were to allow for it?
Well, I think the new urbanists have really tried to push that. They've struggled, though, in filling their commercial spaces, and some of the studies that, and they hope eventually that'll happen. And sometimes Kentlands, I visited that a few years ago, and it's kind of interesting because here was a shopping mall in just out by itself, and then they built a whole residential community around it that feeds into it with pedestrian paths and everything else, and all of a sudden you have a mixed-use community without having to try to, and then some boutique stores sort of developed in a more Main Street kind of posture because of it, but I think that the founders of that ideology have struggled with trying to get their spaces filled, and they've had to look at new strategies to do it. And how much retail do we need? So that's. Probably I'm anxious to see what the market study has to say about what the demand is.
And it identified medical offices, which would be a commercial but not retail kind of use, was one of the ones that.
Yeah, I believe it was, as far as the retail, it was pointing to something similar to Jimmy John's development, was going to be the most profitable for a developer going in. It's going to be single-story, stick-built, some type of single-story retail. But it also indicated that 3-story, stick-built, mixed-use that had retail on the ground floor, but also residential above, or a mixture of medical office and residential, was pretty strong as well. So.
What I liked about the second article was to really start, as you're suggesting, to start to think that mixed use could be done spatially, the corner of the block, the middle of the block, the big street, the backside, and not that every building every time was equally.
I think that's where the flexibility that you're talking about can come in, where you're more building specific. I mean, if economically it works out, you can do anything if you write a big enough check. So that can always change. But yeah, just the idea that the mixed use can go with adjacent buildings rather than adjacent floors.
Well, I found it interesting a few years ago in the reverse, that in downtown Vancouver, I just happened to be there, and all these people were lined up around the block, and we were taking a tour with the city planner as part of a conference, and they were lining up to get an apartment, a tiny apartment, out of a high-rise office building that had been converted into apartments because there wasn't any downtown residential, and so they had to retrofit all of that stuff into the building, and people were. These buildings were filling up instantly with tiny, 12-foot wide bays, and you can imagine trying to be in an apartment too deep. So I think sometimes the market drives the conversions, and people make the economics work when there's the ability to, get that to happen. So if all of a sudden there was a demand for retail space, somebody might, if it was allowed to convert to retail, they might do it if they had a reason to, but to try to regulate how much is going to go in there, it hasn't worked very well, unfortunately. I mean, ideologically it does, but not in reality.
I like the idea of the visual variety that your suggestion, that it doesn't all have to be mixed vertically, it can be mixed horizontally, because it can just, to me, it can start this monotony of da-da, da-da, and so, it might function well in the vertical way, but it could get pretty boring to look at, and I don't think that's what the intent was for Legacy Crossing. I think it was intended to look in a way that really entices people.
The alternative example is, think of the houses on 3rd Street as you go west. Right on the corner of Jackson and 3rd is a bank, and then there's Terragraphics, who owns 2 houses, one on each street, and then it's now the Bicycle Collective, and then what was formerly the Micro Theater. It's a tattoo place. Yeah. But those 2 houses in the middle there have been commercial uses for a long, long time, but they're sitting there kind of locked in their old houseness. And I remember when the bookstore was where Terragraphics is, and it kind of struggled to make a bookstore work in all those little bedrooms and stuff. So that would be the struggle, is if it gets built out in Legacy Crossing residential, then how long does it stay locked into an undesirable form for the new use that's trying to get in? I think we've all seen houses that have been turned into restaurants, and they struggle in the same kinds of ways.
There are those two houses on South Washington that are
There's a psychiatrist or
Psychiatry.
something, yeah.
built.
Kind of
Both
medical
of them.
campus stuff, yeah.
I think here our population base is so small that we can't ever really count on, you could do 4 blocks of retail on the ground floor and apartments above. It's just not going to happen. And then, so the only way out of that really is to allow as much flexibility of use as you can. And especially in an area like the Legacy Crossing, where that's kind of what you want, is the mix that kind of keeps the whole thing cooking along in a number of different fronts.
All right. I thought those were interesting readings, and I particularly learned from the spatial kind of mixed-use one. Any other thoughts? Anything else before we adjourn? All right. We're adjourned.